Hello, and welcome to you all. My name is Professor Ann Karagosian, and it is my pleasure as the director of the Promise Armenian Institute at UCLA to welcome you to our latest lecture of the academic year, to be delivered today by Dr. Khatchig Mouradian of Columbia University and the U.S. Library of Congress on the subject of internment and destruction, concentration camps during the Armenian Genocide. This subject is particularly significant at this time, of course, as we recently commemorated the 106th anniversary of the start of the Armenian Genocide on April 24. The use of concentration camps and internment is well known for the Holocaust, but only recently have scholars such as Dr. Mouradian examined in detail the internment camps that are known to have been used during the Armenian Genocide as a weapon of annihilation. We are grateful to Dr. Mouradian for agreeing to speak to us on this important subject today. For today's lecture, I am grateful to note the co-sponsorship of the UCLA Richard Hovhannissian Endowed Chair in Modern Armenian History, the UCLA Center for Near Eastern Studies, the National Association for Armenian Studies and Research, and the Ararat Eskidjan Museum. As has become our custom, my UCLA colleague, Professor Sebu Aslanian, will provide formal introduction for our speaker in a moment. But let me note that for those of you who are watching live via the Zoom webinar platform, you have an opportunity to send questions to us by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom portion of your screen and typing in the question. Please be sure to be as specific as possible in your question, and we will direct as many of the questions as are practical to our lecturer when he is finished speaking. We anticipate that the lecture itself will take around 45 minutes, after which we will begin the Q&A session. Also, please note that this lecture is being recorded for future viewing at our Promise Armenian Institute website and on our YouTube channel. And now it gives me great pleasure to turn the webinar over to Professor Sebu Aslanian of UCLA's Department of History. Professor Aslanian is the inaugural director of the Armenian Studies Center within the UCLA Promise Armenian Institute, and has been the holder of the Richard Hovhannissian Endowed Chair in Modern Armenian History since 2012. Professor Aslanian is an expert in early modern and modern Armenian history and has recently completed his second book manuscript entitled Early Modernity and Mobility, Port Cities and Printers Across the Armenian Diaspora, 1512 to 1800. Which is expected to appear through Yale University Press in 2022. So Sebu, I'll turn this over to you now.
Thank you very much, Anne. Welcome, everyone. I join my esteemed colleague, Dr. Ann Karagosian, and welcoming all of you to this important event hosted by our institute. We are truly honored and thankful to have Dr. Khatchig Mouradian join us today in making this lecture possible. After my brief introduction, Dr. Mouradian will deliver his talk titled Internment and Destruction, Concentration Camps During the Armenian Genocide, and will speak for roughly 45 to 50 minutes, following which we will open up the floor to questions. Let me reiterate that I ask the audience members to write down your questions as succinctly as possible and to communicate them to us via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens. We will field as many questions as time will permit. Now, Dr. Khatchig Mouradian is a lecturer in Middle Eastern history, South Asian and African Studies, MESAAS, at Columbia University. He is the author of The Resistance Network, The Armenian Genocide and Humanitarianism in Ottoman Syria, 1915 to 1918. In 2021, Mouradian was appointed the Armenian and Georgian area specialist in the African and Middle Eastern division, the Near East section, at the Library of Congress, and has served previously as the Henry S. Khanzadian Kazan visiting professor at California State University, Fresno in the fall of 2016. From 2015 to 2016, he was a visiting assistant professor at the Division of Global Affairs at Rutgers University. Mouradian holds a PhD in history from the Strassler Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Clark University, and a graduate certificate in conflict resolution from the University of Massachusetts, Boston, as well as a Bachelor in Sciences in Biology from the Haigazian University, where he also completed graduate coursework in clinical psychology. So without further delay, I now invite Dr. Mouradian to the virtual podium, and thank you again, Khatchig, for joining us today.
Thank you. I'd like to thank the Promise Institute at UCLA, Dr. Karagosian, Professor Karagosian, Professor Aslanian for this opportunity, and everyone at the Institute who facilitated this over the past couple of weeks, particularly Hasmik Baldasarian, as well as the co-sponsors of this event. Today's talk is going to be focusing on concentration camps during the Armenian Genocide. And as I discuss this theme, I will be, exploring several aspects of the broader context, the history of concentration camps in general, from their emergence in the late 19th century as a weapon of counterinsurgency, and eventually a strain of civilian internment that turns deadly and is used for the destruction of civilian populations. So let's start. In a field that rain had turned into a pond, thousands of tents are set on the mud and water holes. By the tents lie dead and dying people, so many that undertakers the authorities appointed from the camp population can hardly keep up. These are the words of Father Dajjad Arslanian, written right after the Great War, describing his arrival into the Bab concentration camp, Al-Bab, northeast of Aleppo in modern-day Syria in November 1915. Now, before I proceed, I'd like to share a map to give us a sense of the geographic region that I will be covering and some of these camps that I will be referring. This is a region, almost a triangle-shaped region that is at the core of my book, The Resistance Network. On the left side, you have Aleppo. On the right side, you have, on top, you have Ras Al Ain, and Deir ez-Zor is towards the bottom of the map. Now, the Euphrates, as you notice, is where a number of dots are identified. Many of these dots are major concentration camps during the Armenian Genocide. Some of them were places where up to 80,000 Armenian deportees were interned, were imprisoned. There are also a number of towns along the Euphrates that are seen here, like Raqqa, Deir ez-Zor, and many of these towns will have camps nearby as well, as I'm going to be mentioning. In the distance, you see Aleppo, and around Aleppo, there were also a number of transit camps, like, and a major concentration camp, which is Al-Bab. You will also notice that many of these names are also familiar from the news. Ras Al Ain, Aleppo, Al-Bab, Deir ez-Zor, and Raqqa have been in the news over the past almost a decade at this point, with the bloody war in Syria raging and the events that led to it. So another map, this one prepared by Aram Andonian, indicates many of these sites of internment and massacre in Armenian. And the map that I just showed you is partly based on this map prepared by Aram Andonian, himself a survivor and a chronicler of the experience of Armenians in this region and beyond. So Father Arslanyan, whose words I just shared with you, was one of hundreds of thousands of Ottoman Armenians interned in concentration camps set up by the Young Turk leadership during World War I. Although he survived, most of those who went through the camp system died of starvation, disease, exposure, and violence. And while the Armenian Genocide has received rigorous scholarly examination internationally over the past 2 decades, it has only recently been linked to the wartime internment of civilians. So what I will do in this talk is situate the deportation and destruction of Armenians in Ottoman Syria within the global history of internment. I'll provide an overview of the structure, administration, and life in concentration camps based on Armenian accounts, Ottoman archives, and Western diplomatic records. And I will argue that this glaring manifestation of total war, one directed towards the Ottoman Empire's very own Armenian subjects, constitutes an important moment of transition in the use of internment as a weapon of annihilation. So a few words in the beginning about the history of concentration camps. As Professor Karagosian mentioned, concentration camps are typically associated with the Holocaust and Nazi Germany. However, the birth of the concentration camp in its modern form, at least, dates back to the late 19th century. The term itself, as well as the term reconcentration, is used in the context of the Spanish who created such camps in Cuba in the late 1800s, as well as several other cases that occurred in quick succession. In fact, the British in South Africa, what is referred to as the Boer War or the South African War, the Americans in the Philippines, all within just a few years in late 19th, early 20th century. These three examples that I gave are cases where concentration camps are used to essentially place civilians in these sites as a way of combating insurgencies. So the thinking behind it is that we remove the civilian population from a particular region and place them in concentration camps. This way, they will be unable to support insurgents in that area, and the insurgents themselves are going to lose their support base, and therefore it will be easier to attack insurgents and neutralize them in this kind of a policy. And typically, in all these three cases, this policy of civilian internment was accompanied by scorched earth tactics. So essentially burning crops, burning farms in order to deprive, again, insurgents of any kind of support that they may seek or shelter. So this is how the concentration camps are born in this period. Now, it's important to note here that one way of thinking about concentration camps, although this is imperfect and I'm oversimplifying here, is to think of them in general. Prisons are places where people are, at least in principle, supposed to be sent for what they have done. Concentration camps are seen or defined as places where people are sent for who they are, right? It's also important to note that we're talking about civilian populations here. So these camps are different from, say, prison of war camps, right, where we have combatants, interned. Now, these are the three early cases that I mentioned, and in the immediate aftermath of these three cases, in 1904, in German Southwest Africa, which is modern-day Namibia, the German military takes this concentration camp that at this point had become one of the tools, one of the weapons in the toolbox of empires, and uses it as a weapon of annihilation. This happens in German Southwest Africa against the Herero and Nama peoples, in which case we're not talking about an insurgency. The insurgency was already suppressed. There was, and then those who survived the genocide were placed in concentration camps in German Southwest Africa between 1904 and 1907. And essentially, these were places where people were expected to work to death. In many ways, the first death camps emerge in modern-day Namibia, back then called German Southwest Africa, in the first decade of the 20th century. Now, there's a lot of debate among scholars about the continuity between these early cases of German camps and World War II, right? And one of the points that I make is that in my work is that there's this continuity. There might not be a direct line, but certainly the Armenian experience and the concentration camps during the Armenian Genocide are part of this thread of this violent strain that leads from German Southwest Africa to the Ottoman Empire, and then ultimately to Nazi Germany. Now, while it is true that the destruction of Ottoman Armenians now features in many studies of the Great War, concentration camps set up during the genocide are rarely explored in the literature. Scholars of World War I and civilian internment are hardly to blame for this. Armenian genocide scholarship itself has only recently started exploring the network of concentration camps where deportees were interned. Indeed, apart from a survey of these camps by historian Raymond Kevorkian, who also was on my dissertation committee alongside Professor Taner Akçam and Professor Deborah Dwork. So apart from Professor Kevorkian's landmark history of the Armenian Genocide, one is hard-pressed to find any scholarly work on this topic. There are many reasons for this, including denial, access to sources, and I'm happy to explore and elaborate on this later on. Now, while the concentration camps established during the Armenian Genocide can be placed along the continuum of imperial military extremism and wartime totalization, they also drew much from a centuries-old Ottoman experience of demographic engineering. Again, it's important to note that this is not something just that the Ottomans learned from, say, the British, the Germans, or others, but also it's part of an Ottoman history extending over centuries of controlling populations, forcibly moving populations, and demographic engineering. Now, again, I'm happy to talk about that aspect as well, but I'd like to focus on the camps specifically during the Armenian Genocide now, and talk a little bit about how they were run, how they operated, and what happened in these camps during World War I. Now, the Armenian deportees who survived the terrible journey, the massacres, the deportation, and arrived in Ottoman Syria from the north or northeast, typically important arrival points and nodes were Aleppo and Ras Al Ain, depending on which direction they were coming from. They passed through a series of hastily erected rest areas and transit camps before being interned in concentration camps near Aleppo and Ras Al Ain, as well as along the lower Euphrates from Meskeneh to Deir ez-Zor. So, although there were a number of directions in which Armenian deportees were sent in Syria, in Ottoman Syria, the bulk of the survivors who have survived the first round of massacres essentially are sent in this direction: Aleppo, Ras Al Ain, and then from there along the Euphrates into concentration camps and ultimately to Deir ez-Zor. Although exact figures are impossible to ascertain without access to official Ottoman documents, we have some, but not all of these documents are accessible. Around 400,000 Armenians were interned for months in one or more of these camps. Most perished from starvation and disease, or were later massacred in Deir ez-Zor in the summer of 1916. Now, these camps were not just hastily set up. We have documents from the Ottoman archives that actually outline how many of these camps are supposed to run. Ottoman officials charted the deportation to the region in a guideline, Talimatname, which scrupulously laid out the administrative structure and command chain for the transit and settlement network, right? There are a number of sites. These are referred to as transit sites, camps, settlement sites, depending on how long of a period deportees are expected to spend in these locations. I'll say more about this later. It also provided the rest of the settlement sites and with functionaries who were responsible for deportation, storage, and distribution of supplies. There are detailed salary ranges for these officials. They outline the necessity of the modes of ensuring deportees' comfort and security, with particular attention to women and children and the sick. They called for temporary shelter, tents, distributing tents, long-term housing, cultivable land, livestock, and assistance to the poor. In painstaking detail, this ordinance outlined procurement and distribution processes, how to secure flour in each locale, to immediately establishing bakeries and producing bread, etc. And it's just fascinating how when we look at these documents and when we look at the reality on the ground, the stark difference between the two. So the ordinance was a far cry from what unfolded on the ground, where deprivation, exposure, abuse, and danger to life and limb were pervasive, and where settlement was a euphemism for incarcerating hundreds of thousands of Armenians in concentration camps in the desert with paltry, if any, food rations and no means of self-sustenance. Elsewhere in my book, I say that the Armenians were sent to be settled under the sands of the desert, although there's this constant language in these documents about settling Armenians. Describing the camps he witnessed between Meskeneh and Deir ez-Zor along the Euphrates, August Bernau, a German employee who served as the Aleppo agent of the American Vacuum Oil Company, wrote, "Camp is saying a lot because the majority of this wretched people are left in the open air like cattle, without shelter, almost without clothing, and are barely supported by a completely insufficient diet." He continued, "The administration, which took on itself to lead them through the desert, does not care about feeding them. It even seems that it may be a principle of the government to let them die of hunger. A massacre would have been more humane." End of quote. The American and German consuls in Aleppo forwarded this report, Bernau's report, to their superiors in September 1916. Passages from the report appeared in newspapers in Europe and the United States. The New York Times published segments of Bernau's report anonymously, noting that it is prepared by an eyewitness whose character and standing are vouched for by the eminent men of this country. This was not, however, the first time the newspaper of record reported on prison camps for Armenian deportees in Ottoman Syria. We have a number of reports in the New York Times as well about many of these camps, and different terms are employed to them, prison camps being one of them. And here, perhaps it would be good to say a few words quickly about terminology. I'm happy again later on to expand on this. The Ottomans themselves used different terms when they're referring to these sites, whether they refer to them as settlement areas, transit camps, transit sites, camps, etc. The Germans often referred to them as concentration camps, the very same term that is used later on during World War II. And we have the term concentration camp also being used by other European countries, newspapers, and reports. So a few words about how these camps operated. First, about control of movement. Concentration and transit camps were close enough to towns and outposts with telegraphs to ensure Ottoman administrative control. So typically, a camp would be something like a 30-minute walking distance from the closest town. So in the case of the concentration camp of Al-Bab, it was, again, walking distance of 30 minutes from the city of Al-Bab, right? So this allows administrative communication so that camp officials can receive orders and can act upon them and can communicate with authorities. And this also facilitates supplies and other administrative needs in in many of these camps. So I gave the example of Bab. In the Meskeneh camp, for example, was not very close to a town, but it did have a telegram center nearby. So there has to be at least some form of communication with the authorities. Although most camps in Ottoman Syria were not surrounded by barbed wire, there are some exceptions, but by barbed wire or any other form of physical confinement, a series of measures prevented escape. Roads and bridges nearby were guarded. Remember that we are talking in many cases about camps along the Euphrates. So if a town is on the eastern side of the river, the camp would be on the western side, and the bridges would be guarded. Another manifestation would be there are also other steps that were taken. Not just guarding bridges and roads, but gendarmes and camp guards made sure deportees did not leave the premises. So there were gendarmes and guards on the outside of the camps, around it, and also many guards within the camps, making sure, running the affairs of the camps. It is interesting to note here, and important to note here, that typically most duties inside the camps were entrusted to Armenian guards. They were referred to as bekjis, the Turkish word for guard, and gendarmes guarded the perimeters. Like the kapos employed by the SS as an auxiliary of terror in Nazi camps, the bekjis were expected to control and intimidate the other prisoners in return for certain privileges. So in most of these camps, the guards running the affairs of the camp inside many of them were Armenians, Armenian deportees themselves, who through certain connections with officials or bribes or some other way had acquired these positions. And this gave them a slight advantage or edge over the other prisoners, because they essentially received some kind of beneficial, some kind of positive treatment. The guards were also had a head of the guard, Bekçi Başı, who is also in most cases they could be Armenian or Ottoman Turkish officials, and then of course the rest of the hierarchy of the camp, Armenians were essentially kept out of, as one can imagine. So essentially the camp director, the deportations directors, the directors for supplies, all were not Armenian. They were Turkish and other Circassian, other officials who were running the affairs of the camps. This is critical because in many ways, this was a way in which Ottoman Turkish officials did not endanger themselves. Many of these camps were places where typhus and other diseases, epidemics were spreading like wildfire. Many of these camps were places where the deportees didn't just sit back and take abuse. They tried to push back. So using Armenians as the intermediary guards and the intermediaries was very convenient. And this is very common, by the way, in many cases of incarceration, right? You have using the local population against essentially by dividing and ruling. So it was practically impossible for Armenian deportees who were imprisoned in these camps to escape. Still, some managed to exit camps secretly and return with supplies or abscond to Aleppo and disappear into the fabric of the metropolis. I give a number of cases. I talk about a number of such cases in my book. Just to list a few examples, Gurji Ananyan from Marash arrived in Meskeneh in the summer of 1915 and tried to escape from the camp twice, trying to return to Aleppo. On his first attempt, he was with 34 other inmates. This turned into a week-long ordeal, during which they were robbed twice by Arabs in the desert, captured by gendarmes, and dragged back to Meskeneh. He then succeeded in his second attempt and made it to Aleppo after being beaten, harassed, and nearly buried alive by villagers along the way. But the camps were semi-porous. So locals from the area generally were allowed to enter the camps to sell products, purchase children, and we have many examples of this, or still steal and abduct prisoners during night raids, with gendarmes often passively observing or aiding and abetting the perpetrators in return for a share of the booty. Accounts describe, for instance, how butchers came to the camp to sell meat, sometimes distributed usually discarded offal, internal organs of animals, to needy deportees, but after some time they started selling that as well. And so it's important to see, to think about these camps as places from where, by and large, Armenians are unable to come out, escape, but on the other hand, locals are coming in, and at night, attacks by bandits are regular. A few words about sexual violence. Sexual violence and slavery were rampant in these camps. According to a German eyewitness account in the Ras Al Ain camp, for example, the Circassians and Arabs from Ras Al Ain took the prettiest girls home with them. The policemen carried on a flourishing trade with the girls. Against payment of a few medjidias, anyone could take a girl of his choice, either for a short while or forever. End of quote. You have examples like this, reports like this, in all kinds of sources, whether it's eyewitness accounts, whether it's reports by consuls and missionaries, or survivor accounts and memoirs. This was a rampant process. I will not delve into it because of time restrictions, but I wanted to make sure that I put it out there. And in many ways, sexual violence is a critical, integral part of the experience of these camps. Now, the camp directors themselves actually very much participated in this. In concentration camps, for example, the violation of women served as a perverted manifestation of male bonding through control over the bodies of victims. It also took place within a broader context that encouraged sexual violence and looting to incentivize popular participation in the Armenian Genocide. If we look at places such as the region that I'm talking about, as well as other areas around all over the Ottoman Empire, it becomes clear that this process is not just the role. This is not being committed by just a cadre of Young Turk leaders and their followers and gendarmes. There is broad popular participation in this in many areas. And this participation is often incentivized and fueled through promises of looting and sexual violence and rape. People and it's not like we don't even know their names. We know in many cases in these camps, the names of the people who abducted women, the camp directors, the camp officials who took part in this. And I outline much of this in my work as well. A few words about death and burial. So camps are places, as you can imagine, where people are dying every single day of exposure, of violence. In the case of, for example, Ras Al Ain, there are days when up to 500 people are dying in a single day. So how did death and burial work? Typically every morning, you would have undertakers. Just a quick note here, just like some Armenians served as guards, and they were expected to be harsh with fellow Armenians, otherwise they would lose their jobs and their privileges, right? And somebody else would take their place. Their undertakers were also chosen oftentimes from the Armenian prisoner population of these camps. Again, the dirty work, had to be done by the Armenians themselves. This was the kind of way it was run. So what happened is that undertakers would go around the camp every morning, yelling "Ölüsü olan, ölüsü olan," whoever has dead people, and people would drag the corpses out of the tents or whatever shelter they had, and these bodies would be taken right outside the camps, where they would be mass graves and they would be buried there. There are horrendous images of how during this process, many of these mass graves were not properly covered up, And at nighttime, you have the animals coming and dragging the bodies out. Horrendous images, which I don't want to go into too much. So this is not, and of course, in many of these cases, there was an effort for whenever there was a priest at the camp, for there to be some prayers, and before many of these bodies were interred. But Armenians did not just sit in these camps and wait to die. They tried as much as possible in many ways to find ways to survive and subsist under these difficult circumstances and conditions. I talked about death and burial, but there were even Armenians who got married in camps. We have memoirs and diaries and accounts talking about people getting married because they don't want to die alone. We have cases where, there's an Armenian man and a woman who wanted to live together, and they get married, and in Meskeneh. And they, on the day of their wedding, they donate the very little bread that they have to a tent orphanage that was opened by a few women in Meskeneh around that time. So you see these many acts of solidarity. You see many acts of people trying to maintain a sense of dignity in a sea of despair, death, and violence. But not only that, there was also organized forms of communication. And I allocate a lot of real estate in the book to this. Armenians within many of these camps had journalists who essentially, every time a new convoy arrived into the camp, this is a new group of people. They have been walking, they've been marched across who knows how many, tens or hundreds of kilometers, and therefore they have fresh information. So some of these journalists would go and write down their accounts on little pieces of paper, and then they would share those little pieces of paper with others in the camp. This was a way of learning what is going on out there. And it was a way of having some kind of intel and knowledge about the circumstances in other camps as well. It's important to note that, and my book is called The Resistance Network because it focuses on a network of underground network of humanitarians, many of them Armenians who are involved in assisting, saving, and helping Armenians who are caught in the claws of destruction and genocide. And in that sense, I talk a lot about these efforts to push back and resist, even without unarmed resistance. These are forms of unarmed resistance. And they include crucial participation by women and even by children. So in many of these camps, even in the middle of the desert, you have women organizing ways of trying to help children who are orphaned, organizing against the local authorities, or trying to procure food for others, help others, or send reports to missionaries in Aleppo, secretly telling them, communicating to them what is going on in these camps. It's critical to note that it was not a possibility to visit these camps along the Euphrates. For most people, diplomats, missionaries were not allowed here, right? So there is much of what we glean and learn about what is going on inside is oftentimes from either the Armenians themselves or the perpetrators. And I'm happy to talk about sources later on as well. Children is another group that were not just needed care and attention, but they also played a part in this humanitarian resistance effort. Children used to communicate messages, written messages, from one camp to the other, and they would leave the camp, escape from the camp in the cloak of darkness, and would arrive at the next camp, beg for food the next day in that camp, and then return with a return message and whatever information they were seeking. There were also many Armenians, and I document their role, who were couriers, were distributing assistance and funds in many of these camps, arriving secretly from Aleppo and elsewhere, and many of these people die in the line of duty. Many of these people are killed, are arrested and tortured because they were secretly, clandestinely distributing food and medication to deportees in these concentration camps. One of the central arguments I make in the book is that Armenians in this region that is under study between Aleppo, Ras Al Ain, and Deir Zor are not just victims of violence on the one hand and the recipients of Western humanitarianism on the other. They are a critical part of this humanitarian resistance network that's trying to save lives. And I make this point by just demonstrating how, we often talk about the huge amounts of money that were raised in the United States and elsewhere by organizations like Near East Relief and its predecessors. But if we really look at how these funds are actually, during the Armenian Genocide, are getting to the survivors and deportees in many of these concentration camps, we notice that these funds were actually being transferred from the American, for example, consul in Aleppo, Jesse Jackson, to Armenian religious and secular leaders in Aleppo, who were in turn handing these funds to couriers who are also Armenian, who are going into these camps, sometimes making a week or 2 week journeys in order to succeed in their tasks. And in many cases, they will die in Deir Zor and the surrounding areas. We don't know much about many of these people because there are very few accounts that have survived. Very few of these people themselves have survived the genocide. In certain cases, in one case, I only know the first name of one of these couriers who was working with Beatrice Rohner, a teacher and a missionary Swiss in Aleppo, as well as the American consul in Aleppo. Now, to conclude, I want to say a couple of words and then talk about the liquidation of the camps. Armenians were not just trying to push back, escape, and resist in these camps. Many others were actually trying to collaborate. I give examples of some Armenians who actually were trying to exploit this situation, and through some connections with post office officials, with guards and others, actually tried to benefit from the suffering of their fellow Armenians. So collaboration is another important component that is not studied, hasn't received scholarly attention when it comes to the Armenian genocide. Now, a few words about the liquidation of these camps. What happened with these camps? Remember, these camps are set up beginning with the first arrivals of Armenian deportees in the region, beginning as early as May 1915. And then in subsequent months, as more and more deportees and survivors are arriving, many of these camps are going to become enlarged. Many of these camps that are supposed to be transit camps are going to turn into concentration camps where people spend months and die there. Meskeneh is an example. Bab is an example. So the liquidation of these camps occurred in two distinct phases. The camps around Aleppo were shut down beginning in the winter of 1915, and the deportees were driven either towards Ras Al Ain or the lower Euphrates, where while the camps in Ras Al Ain and the ones that were along the Euphrates River were emptied starting in spring of 1916. And there, the survivors were marched to Deir Zor. So those who did not escape to Aleppo or other cities and disappear in the fabric of the city, and those who did not die in these camps, were, by the spring of 1916, as these camps were shut down, they were pushed in the direction of Deir Zor. What happens here? How is this happening? Let me give a couple examples to illustrate how this redeportation occurs, right? This is after deportation that Armenians are experiencing it by this point. The emptying of the Dipsy camp, for example, illustrates the process. In late April 1916, some 20 gendarmes were dispatched from Meskeneh to liquidate the Psi camp, to shut it down. Considering the condition of most prisoners, emptying the camp and sending everyone downstream was not easy. How do the gendarmes force people to move? These are exhausted, sick. They set fire to the tents and assault the deportees to force them to move. The liquidation of the Ottoman camps was followed by further massacres. Whenever we talk about the Deir ez-Zor massacres, this is happening toward the summer of 1916, after months of Armenians languishing and dying in concentration camps in the region. Most of the deportees who survived the camp system perished in two waves of violence. The first was in Ras Al Ain around March of 1916, and the second was in Deir ez-Zor in the summer and fall of 1916. Estimates vary, but conservative figures indicate some 30,000 were killed in Ras Al Ain and up to 200,000 in Deir ez-Zor. Thousands of others survived primarily through the efforts of this humanitarian network, while thousands more, mostly women and children, were saved from the carnage by tribesmen in the region who forced them to become their wives, workers, or sex slaves. Many survivors wrote about their camp experience in newspaper articles and memoirs published in the years following the genocide. Yet it took almost a century for the first scholarly examinations of their internment to appear. The massacres and sporadic instances of resistance overwhelmed the accounts, while scholarship focused on dispossession, deportation, death, and denial. As a result, periods between massacres were relegated to footnotes. So this entire camp experience that lasts for months, right, doesn't appear in the scholarship for a couple of decades. To give an example, in his history of the Armenian Genocide, Vakhtang Dadrian, the pioneer of Armenian genocide studies, wrote that for survivors arriving in Syria, I'm quoting here, the authorities had created a string of way stations in the desert from which they were regularly dispatched to their ultimate death by a variety of methods, end of quote. And then there's a footnote that directs the reader to an article that says very little about the camp system, pretty much nothing. And this is all that we see in that particular work, The History of the Armenian Genocide by Vakhtang Dadrian. This is a typical example, by the way. This is what we see in early scholarship. Yet, as I demonstrate in my book, The Resistance Network, the camp system was an integral part of the genocidal process. While it is true that neither mass murder nor heroic acts of armed resistance occurred in these camps, deprivation and exposure and violence destroyed life, and it was part of the extermination policy. The authorities sent Armenians to these camps for them to die alone. Instead of spreading the disease, typhus, into cities, urban areas, and elsewhere, they sent them to these camps, isolated them for them to die there alone. And despite this, you have a way in which Armenians are organizing within these camps in order to escape, in order to survive, and in order to push back. And in this way, the concentration camps in Ottoman Syria during World War I are a bridge between the colonial cases and modern histories of internment and the Holocaust, and the case of the Holocaust later on. And as such, the importance of addressing the Ottoman camp system and the need for comparative research on the function and trajectory of internment in the late 19th and early 20th centuries cannot be overstated. Let me quote here as I conclude from Bernal again. He says, "One counts by the hundreds the anonymous burial mounds for these victims of a barbarism without a name." He's referring to the mass graves near and around these concentration camps. The annihilation of European Jewry was ongoing when Raphael Lemkin coined the term genocide in 1943-44, giving the barbarism Bernal refers to a name. And It is critical, however, to see that in many ways, the first such crime, the first attempt to destroy an entire population through civilian internment was not the Holocaust. And there is a line that connects German Southwest Africa, the colonial use of concentration camps, to Auschwitz, and it was passing from the Ottoman Empire. Let me conclude by one image that says something about the here and now. Meanwhile, these are a couple examples. One is one of the newspapers, handwritten newspapers from Meskeneh, and it's from Armenian archives at the HBU Nubar Library in Paris. The other is a handwritten account of the deaths in Meskeneh by the camp director of Meskeneh for a year between May of 1915 till May of 1916. And it demonstrates how you have tens of thousands of people who are dying in the camp. This is an image that I took in Deir Zor right before the war in Syria erupted. And in many ways, when we talk about Deir Zor, right, when we talk about this site that is often referred to as the Auschwitz of the Armenian Genocide, we are often referring to this experience that I just outlined that culminated in the massacres in Deir Zor in the summer of 1916. And we still see the remains of Armenians, as many of you know, in this region, in this area that is now caught in the vortex of renewed violence. These are a few lines by a child survivor, Musharish Khan, who became a prominent poet and educator in subsequent years in the diaspora. And he says, and it's my translation, the poem is titled Remember Me. And he says, "You do not know me. I am the child raised with love, who exhausted and half nude fell asleep in the desert of Deir Zor to never wake up. I do not want adornments, nor any warm woolen clothes. Skeletons are always nude. But when you get warm bread from the baker, make sure to remember me." Now, at that last visit to Deir Zor that I made before the war, a new mass grave from the Armenian Genocide was discovered as in the town of Bushehr, they're building a school. And as they're digging up, these bones start coming out and they build the school right next to that mound instead of building over the mass grave. And that mass grave had become the playground for the children. And as we scratch the surface, pulling out the bones from this mass grave, the children started bringing bones themselves to us. And they would say, we would ask them, like, what are these? And they would say, Armeni. Now, I often wonder what happened to these children. These are places that today are places of death, suffering, massacres, and refugee crises. I always wonder where these children ended up. And in recent weeks, on a number of occasions, I have showed this particular photograph. But just perhaps as testament to the layers of violence in the region, and testament to these lines here by poet Sahag Mesrab, who was in the region. And he wrote and published an entire poetry book about his experiences in this region, in these camps and beyond, where he says, essentially, he talks about how, excuse me. He talks about how, he says, your inhabitants, slaughterhouse Zor, will forever chew on Armenian corpses and always drink blood. So recently, as I said, I've shown this image a number of times during talks. And a couple of weeks ago, I received a message from someone I do not know from Syria, who actually told me that the kid with the white t-shirt in the front of the picture actually died during the war. So in many ways, the legacy of these sites, where layer upon layer of violence still haunts us to this day, these sites that have often remained neglected in a part of the world where violence is something that we watch from afar, from a distance, and we our knowledge of it is often very superficial, is sort of an invitation perhaps for us to be more closely aware of a number of things. And I keep emphasizing this in my work as well. One is that thinking to shift our thinking about humanitarianism and humanitarian involvement in different regions of the world, and thinking about how we can support locals who are doing an important chunk of the work as they try to push back against violence and genocide, as opposed to engaging or reinforcing a narrative where Westerners are coming and saving, right? And this is at the core of the Armenian Genocide, by the way, at the core of the way in which we often think about the Armenian Genocide as, you know, Western humanitarianism saving hundreds of thousands of lives, while forgetting that on the ground, it was oftentimes Armenians and other locals, Muslims, Jews, and others, as I demonstrate in my book, who were part of this pushing back, who were part of this effort. And ultimately, they are the unsung heroes of the Armenian Genocide as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Khatchig, for an inspiring and inspired talk. We are very grateful to you. We have a number of questions from our audience, as well as a couple that Professor Aslani and I have generated. Sebu, would you like to ask your first question?
Sure. First, thank you so much, Khatchig. That was really a very well-textured, rich talk. So I have a couple of questions to begin with. My first one has to do with the question of continuity and discontinuity, and the role of the traditional methods of sürgün, as you know, which were used, time-tested in that region by the Ottomans, by the Safavids, by the Mongols, and so on, of deportations without the intent of eradication or extermination. So in your talk, you seem to suggest that in addition to the sürgün, which was in place there is this new element that has to do with the concentration camp, and you gave us a very interesting new perspective, at least for me, of how the concentration camp as a unit emerged in the colonial context with the Spanish in Cuba, and then most interestingly was put into practice by the Germans in Namibia. So the question I have is, in terms of continuity or discontinuity, my question has to do with whether the Ottoman officials devising these camps in Syria and Iraq and so on had actual physical knowledge or communication and awareness of the operation of these camps in Namibia. You seem to suggest that there is a straight line that goes through the Ottoman Empire to Auschwitz. So I suppose my question would be, does the Kalimat Name that you mentioned, that was written in August of 1915, that has guidelines of how to run a concentration camp, does that document in any way indicate an awareness of this German precedent? And so I'm wondering if you could comment on that first. And my second question, a larger question, is more historiographic and has to do with the enigma of why it took so long for Armenian scholars and others as well to actually focus on what Kevorkian called la deuxième phase du génocide, this very thing that you're talking about. As we know, Kevorkian is the mastermind of unearthing this documentation from the Andonian archives and using it to paint a mosaic of concentration camps in that region. And that was published in 1999 or 98 in his book. So You pointed out that Dadrian has a fleeting mention of it, but no elaboration whatsoever before Kevorkian. Obviously, he didn't work on the Andonian records as much as Kevorkian did. So I'm wondering, why is it that it took even Kevorkian that long to focus on the concentration camp element, infrastructure of this, of the larger historiography on the genocide? So I'll begin with those two questions, and then we'll switch to questions from the audience.
Thank you for these two great questions. As far as knowledge is concerned by the Ottoman authorities, let me take a first step back and quickly say that in the scholarship on these early cases of concentration camps, scholars argue, and this is not, this is essentially part of the established scholarship, that newspapers and actually provided a way in which knowledge of these camps spread around the globe in different parts of the world. And different governments actually, however, the way they acted, different empires, was even when they saw that, for example, it's causing horrible civilian casualties in a place like Cuba, where the Spanish were essentially separating the civilians from the insurgents, tens of thousands died. Some scholars even refer to it as genocidal. The lesson that many of these empires learned was not that this is bad and we should not intern civilians in camps, but the lesson was that, well, we can do it better. And this is why the concentration camp not only survives, but thrives. So in the colonial period, you have this spread of concentration camps, and each empire will oftentimes use the other empire's camps as a way of criticizing it. So you see this, right? The Americans in the Philippines will avoid using the term concentration camp because they themselves, journalism in America at that point, and yellow journalism, were constantly criticizing the Spanish about their policies in Cuba. So this is a context about awareness globally. So this was part of the discussion and discourse. But to go specifically to the Ottomans themselves very much knew about what is going on. The Ottomans themselves not only knew about it, but also there was public discussion about the Boer experience. In recent years, a number of books have been published about or republished articles and books in Turkey about the Boer War and the way in which it has been reflected upon and discussions around it in the Ottoman Empire. So much of this is part of the consciousness of certainly the decision makers, right? The public, as far as we're talking about the segment of the society that is following these developments and is reading newspapers, etc. As far as the Talimatname is concerned itself, it is one that it is difficult to connect it directly with German Southwest Africa. That is not, it's particularly because in the case of German Southwest Africa, the documents that we have, and there's a vast, a large number of documents that we have, are in no way portraying these camps as places where people have to be taken care of to the to the nth degree, right? These are places that, in certain cases, as some scholars have argued, there were even pre-printed documents, death certificates for the people who were sent to these camps in German Southwest Africa, most of them women and children. So although there is no direct comparison between that particular time, I would argue that in terms of policy, in terms of awareness and knowledge, this is something that is there is a connection, not just with German Southwest Africa, but earlier cases. Mind you, there is denialist scholarship that actually sees the Armenian genocide and the deportation of the Armenians as a counterinsurgency measure in line with the earlier cases that I referred to. So there is that as well. So you would have denialist scholars actually will sometimes invoke these earlier connections. One other quick thing here. So it's also important to note that during World War I itself, civilian internment becomes the rule, globally, with with one important difference though. Civilians in the Ottoman Empire, Armenians in the Ottoman Empire, are placed in concentration camps. And there's, as I mentioned, and as we've talked about, there's huge mortality and violence and death in most of other cases of internment camps around the globe, from Canada, United States, Europe, and elsewhere, where enemy aliens are placed in these camps. We are not talking about any kind of violence, and most of the people survive. The second question is also another one that is a huge and critical question. A few points, perhaps, to answer it very briefly. One is, you refer to it as an enigma. As scholars of the Armenian Genocide early on were trying to construct a model of how the Armenian Genocide unfolded, in a context of denial of the Armenian Genocide, comparability with what is referred to as the intentionalist model of the Holocaust was something that reigned supreme and was very important. So for people like Dadrian, right, and others who are writing on the Armenian Genocide, it was important for the model to look at what is happening during the Armenian Genocide to look very similar to what is happening to the Holocaust, so that you cannot deny the Armenian Genocide. It's a way of pushing against the policy of denial. This is critical because what it does is the part of the Armenian Genocide I'm talking about here, and mind you, when you look at this region that I cover in the book, my reaction always was the Armenian Genocide was not as bad as I thought. The Armenian Genocide was worse than what I thought. But without the tools and the sources and the material and our bringing all these things together, it's difficult to account for or understand why, for several months, you have these Armenians placed in concentration camps and just left to die. And there is no direct massacre, right? So the narrative that we have in those earlier years is the Armenians were deported from all over the Ottoman Empire and sent to Deir Zor, where they were massacred. So if they were not massacred on site, they were sent to Deir Zor and they were massacred there. In this kind of model, it's relentless. Everybody is deported, everybody is targeted for killing, and that is how it's operating. It is the way in which, as I said, the intentionalist school of Holocaust scholarship, even that is not something that is accepted today in that form, narrated the experience. To add to this, and you also made allusion to this, the sources were important. Many scholars of the Armenian Genocide actually, read Ottoman. Let me rephrase that. Many scholars who have written about the Armenian Genocide may read Ottoman, know Western European and other languages, and they're not familiar with the Armenian sources, and therefore a critical source base is inaccessible. And this source base is critical because not only do we understand more when we tap into these sources, we actually can triangulate between different sources. And this is something I do in the book. There's a place where there's some document in the German archives that some scholars have used, making a certain interpretation. The same incident looking in the Ottoman archives, and you use it, you make a different interpretation, and then you bring in the Armenian Patriarchate source, another major source space that I use, the Armenian prelacy of Aleppo sources, and you triangulate these, and the picture becomes a lot more clear. So the sources were another issue as well. So one, in the context of denial, making it look like the Holocaust became key in the early phase, and that has of course changed. Raymond Kevorkian's role is critical in this, transformative in this. Of course, today, in today's world, in today's scholarship, we do not need to constantly, worry about responding to Turkish denialist arguments, which have already been clearly addressed. And of course, it's important to raise these issues, but it's not as much of a hurdle for scholarship to develop in this field. Sorry for I tried to make this as short as possible.
No, I think that's great. But did Dadrian have access to the Bibliothèque Nouvelle collection, which I would assume that he would have if he's doing
Dadrian did have access to many of
research.
these accounts. Yeah, sorry, I didn't address that part of the question. Not only did he have access to these accounts, one of the things, Sebu, and this is key, we look at memoirs of the Armenian Genocide Now, after reading about the concentration camps, we go back to any memoir, and we'll see references to these camps all over the place. No scholar would actually look at it and say, you know what? This is not important. I'm going to set it aside. I'm just going to talk about the massacre. It's an integral part of the experiences of the memoirs of hundreds of survivors who have written about this, hundreds of survivors who have later on been interviewed. So this is not something you miss. It's not something you, it is something that just you make a conscious decision not to engage with for whatever reasons they are. And we can go into motivations. I'm not sure how helpful that is, but ultimately it's not something that is hidden. It's not just in the Andonian archives, although, as I said, it's important to note that, of course, many of these scholars have access to those as well.
Okay, thank you. Anne, you want to curate some questions?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you from me as well. We have a large number of questions, but several of them pertain to the visual evidence for these camps. You have indicated that it was almost impossible for outsiders such as diplomats and missionaries to actually have access to these camps. Is there any evidence that anyone from the outside was able to document this? You also alluded to the New York Times article. Maybe you could elaborate on some of that?
Thank you. So there were several German soldiers who passed through this region and witnessed these. There are multiple accounts by others. I gave August Bernau, his example is common and cited everywhere, because what he does is step by step during the trip, he documents all of what he witnesses. But for many of the missionaries and diplomats who were in places such as Aleppo, etc., actually visiting these camps along the Euphrates was an impossibility. We do know, however, that I allocate a chapter to some of the transit camps around Aleppo, and we do know that the U.S. consul in Aleppo, Jesse Jackson, actually visited some of those sites, those camps. As far as photographs are concerned, there are some images that we have of this experience of the deportees from in this region. We also know of directives and orders preventing soldiers from taking photographs, and particular German soldiers, and other scholars have written about this, Tane Rakçam and others, Hilmar Kaiser, about directives to prevent, and in certain cases when German soldiers have been caught in the act, they have suffered the consequences of breaking these laws. So there is that as well. Just a quick addition to this, there is also visual evidence of these decades after. There is one paper that has been published about, it's essentially an archaeological study of one of the camps, one of the sites. There was another, and this is published, right? There are remnants of the pieces of the tents and many other, like the perimeters of the camp and etc. But and there was another one that was underway. This is before the war, that was actually discontinued by the Syrian authorities, who at that point were having their relations with Turkey were very different than they are right now, and that effort was discontinued, and the scholars have not been allowed to essentially write or publish on that work. So there is many of these places are still decades later, more than a century later, are the evidence is still there.
Okay, thank you. And there's one slightly related question. You've talked about the camps that exist along the Euphrates River largely. Is there any evidence of other concentration camps, for example, associated with the caravans that went from Aleppo to Jordan, or this is where largely the evidence lies?
So there are many camps along other lines. So in the scholarship, for example, by Raymond Kevorkian, he identifies 3 paths, 3 lines What I focus here is the line that leads to their shore. In other cases, you do have camps. These are not camps that you will have people they are smaller. You do have people who are dying in many of these camps of exposure and disease, but there are no outright massacres going on. And as I mentioned, the most lethal and deadly line where the majority of Armenians were sent was this particular one. For more on other paths and camps and life in other areas, there is great work done by scholars such as Vahet Ashtian in his recent book, and others. So because in his case, he does not focus on this line that I am covering. He looks at the less deadly, quote unquote. And when we say less deadly, we're talking about just in terms of outright massacres and killings, a second round of massacres and killings.
Thank you.
So I will field a question from Vache Tsadurian, and his question is one that dovetails with a question I asked earlier about the connected history of the Ottoman genocide with the German one of the Hereros in Southwest Africa. And in that case, I had asked if there was a direct line of connection of information or agents or individuals who passed on information about the usage of concentration camps in Germany by the Germans to the Ottomans. Tsadurian's question is similar. It has to do with connected histories. It's not a term he uses, but one that I like. And his question is as follows. He says, Rudolf Höss, a German officer, was one of the very well-known concentration camp directors at Auschwitz who witnessed the Armenian Genocide. Can we say that the operation of the concentration camps during World War II were inspired, quote unquote, by the Armenian concentration camp precedent before? In other words, is there a line, does that line, as you mentioned earlier, that passes through the Ottoman Empire, does it go straight through individuals in this case, such as Rudolf Höss or maybe others who were operating? There were a number of Germans, obviously, who were affiliated with the Nazi movement, who were on the ground in the Ottoman Empire.
Yes.
This is a well-known fact. Could you elaborate on that?
Yes. The short answer I would make is we don't know. But if I were to guess, probably the answer would be no also. And here's why. I'm careful when I say when I talk about straight lines, because what I say is a little more nuanced. Because what I'd say is there is a strain of using camps for deadly purpose. By the way, it's important to note that there are concentration camps that are being used in this period between World War I and World War II. Eventually, the Gulag, eventually they become the Gulag camps and others, etc., where the intention is not direct genocidal destruction, right? So there are different strains that are developing. One of them is the deadly one. And scholars have made the connection between German Southwest Africa and Nazi Germany. This exists. This scholarship exists. There's a debate among scholars about whether this connection is strong enough, the case is compelling enough for there to be a direct line or not. So that is a huge debate in and of itself. For me to interject into this debate without having again, let's go back to the fact that the study of concentration camps during the Armenian Genocide is at its infancy in terms of the history of connections, right? What I try to do here is first to set the record about the half of the book is about case by case, concentration by concentration camp, telling what is going on, right? But there's a lot of work to be done to go into German archives, the Ottoman archives, in order to address some of these questions. What I would wager to say is that I do not think German officials needed a particular experience in order to develop the concentration camps, right? So it might be a stretch to put it in that sense, but it's also a stretch to actually see the Nazi camp system, the KL system, as being born some kind of sui generis kind of thing, coming out of nowhere, right? It is part of these continuities from this colonial period, and then into World War I, and then developments that take on a different kind of term and a massive industrial scale, of course, during World War II. But the answer to this, I would not be surprised if one day a scholar working on the German archives and trying to connect the dots suddenly says, you know what, let's look at these three things together. Instead of just looking at German Southwest Africa and trying to see if there's anything we can connect with, Nazi Germany, or there are other studies, right? And Professor Aslan, you're aware of this, that connect, comparative studies between the Armenian Genocide and the Holocaust. All right, how about if we take a step back and look at these three experiences in a different way together, as opposed to isolating two? There may be interesting findings from that. And that is the extent to which I'm willing to go on this, just because I really don't know what will come out from the archives and what can be gleaned from that.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
I can ask a quick question if you like. Again, we have a great many here. This comes from Professor Alan Whitehorn. Can we suggest that the Entente Declaration of May 1915 on crimes against humanity and Raphael Lemkin's twin concepts of barbarism and vandalism in the 1930s does that suggest that there were precursor analytical efforts to describe genocide with reference to these mass deportations and killings of Armenians?
As far as Lemkin specifically is concerned, because I'm not an expert in international law, but I can talk about Lemkin because I've worked on that part. Lemkin indeed was influenced by what is going on, was aware of both the declaration, the deliberations, the trials in the aftermath, Operation Nemesis, and much of this impacted his own work. Initially, him thinking about barbarism and vandalism, and then seeing the need of actually coining a new term to describe what is indescribable. There is this need, and you sense it when you read these texts. Samantha Power in her work, A Problem from Hell, again, references American political leaders who are saying a crime without a name. And when I gave the example here of Bernau, he talks about it again. He mentions this, like, there not being a word for this, for what is happening. So in many ways, you have this struggle to understand this kind of enormous crime. And it is only later on, in fact, that Lemkin in 43-44 is going to coin a term that is going to become a critical term in international law, as well as in the social sciences and beyond.
Thank you.
Okay,
now I'm going to have to take off, but thank
sure.
you. Yeah, thanks.
So I have a question. I have a second question. Asya Darbinian, Dr. Darbinian had asked two questions, one of which I asked on my own without seeing it until now. But her second one is one that's worth considering. And the question has to do with historiography and work that remains to be done in the future. And she asks whether future scholarship, whether you have, there are issues that you have not addressed in your book involving the concentration camps that need to be further elaborated in the future, and what elements of this kind of research on the use of concentration camps you think still require a lot more further work.
Thank you. Again, a great question. A number of things. One, there needs to be, it is important to do work that does not just limit to comparisons between the Holocaust and the Armenian Genocide, or the experience in German Southwest Africa, the genocide of the Heder and Lama, and the Holocaust, but also look at this particular deadly trajectory more closely. In the specific case of the Armenian experience, there's a lot of work that can be done. I mean, let's think about it this way. In Raymond Kevorkian's magisterial work, right, on the Armenian Genocide, we have, each camp gets a couple paragraphs. Here, some of these camps get entire chapters, but even that does not really give us all the answers, right? So there's a lot of work to be done on that. For example, there's a lot of interesting work that can be done about the interactions between the local population and many of these camps, right? This is the kind of scholarship that's been done in Holocaust studies, the kind of work that's been done about camps in different parts of Europe, during the Holocaust. And there's a lot of work to be done there in that regard. And this will also require access to sources mostly in the Arabic language, in Ottoman, as well as a fresh look at the Armenian sources. And that would be critical. It gives us an insight into this, what I referred to earlier about mass participation, but also about different reactions, the range of reactions by the local population. I talk about some Arabs, many Muslims and Jews who are helping Armenians in this work, in these camps and beyond. And there's a lot of work to be done in that regard as well. So I do think on a number of fronts, and of course, if and when we have access to the Ottoman archives, particularly as it pertains to the concentration camps, we will be able to conduct to a research on a completely different level. And this is something that I'm not sure if my generation is able to do. The Ottomans had lists of the population every single camp. They had lists of casualties, deaths. Much of this is not accessible. And we know this because some of the people who are making up the list were Armenians who have written memoirs about this. And they have the numbers, right? I use a source, Raymond Kevorkian also uses him, Aghazarian, who's a case in point. So many of these lists are not available right now. And once those lists are available, we are talking about a different kind of scholarship. The same applies, of course, to other documents pertaining to these camps, communication between camp directors and different officials, again, much of which is not accessible.
I would like to now conclude this webinar by thanking Dr. Khatchig Mouradian once again for a very stimulating lecture and discussion. This was certainly an impressive distillation of the work that he has done that has taken shape in his first book, which I encourage everybody out there to go and read. And we are grateful for him for enhancing our understanding and illuminating the issues surrounding crimes against humanity that took place 100 years ago. So let me close our webinar by making a few quick announcements regarding a number of upcoming Zoom or YouTube-based events hosted or co-sponsored by the UCLA Promise Institute. On Friday, May the 21st at noon Pacific time, the UCLA Armenian Music Program and Director Movses Pogosyan invite you to a virtual event dedicated to celebrating Armenian music through a concert and 2 workshops showcasing the treasures of Armenian classical, contemporary, and folk music. On Wednesday, June the 2nd, at 10 a.m. Pacific time, the Promise Armenian Institute is pleased to present the last lecture of this academic year to be delivered by Dr. Sona Tajirian. This year, Dr. Tajirian is our first Promise Armenian Institute postdoctoral fellow, having received her PhD in 2020 under the mentorship of Professor Aslanyan, which is to say me. Dr. Tajirian's lecture is titled Indian Diamonds for Mediterranean Coral, a global Armenian family firm of gem merchants at the crossroads of caravan and maritime trade circa 1670 to 1730. So as you can see, this is well before the darkest period in Armenian history of the 20th century involving the genocide. This explores a more optimistic time when Armenian merchants were crossing boundaries and often accomplishing great feats, and especially in the realm of trade, which Sona Tajirian is expertly trained to handle. And we look forward to learning more about this from her on June the 2nd during her talk. There are also other events in the works for the coming months, even during the summer. So please be sure to visit our UCLA Promise Armenian Institute website or visit us on social media to learn more details about these events and sign up to join our PAI listserv. Once again, thank you all for joining us, and apologies for the technical interruption, and thanks particularly to our speaker, Dr. Khatchig Mouradian. I hope to see you very soon. Goodbye and take care.